No one does superhero stories like James Gunn. Where most superhero movies and TV shows are in line with established formula, James Gunn's shows are quirky, thematically succinct, darkly humorous, and have loads of heart. Whether we are talking about the offbeat Guardians of the Galaxy films, or his more recent bloody R-rated action comedy in The Suicide Squad, James Gunn productions have a lot of character in them. Most they do in how they have a foul-mouthed wit, and often follow traditionally morally suspect characters who are trying to do the best they can in their circumstances, and maybe even learn the meaning of family and friendship alongside all the other fucked up protagonists in those stories. Because Polka Dot Man, am I right? This describes James Gunn's Peacemaker as well. As an HBO Max TV series that acts as a follow-up to the events of the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker features all the clever wordplay, sharp script writing, likably flawed characters, and tendency for the over-the-top violence and gore that was present in past James Gunn productions. Hell, it even includes not one, but two characters with severely bad parental relationships, because, you know, James Gunn. But the most important thing Peacemaker shares with James Gunn's past projects is that it is really good. It features a likably flawed anti-hero in John Cena's title character, fun character dynamics where all the show's characters are chucklefucks that try to work together even though they don't really like each other. There's R-rated dialogue and gore that enhances both the action and the comedy, and there's a thematic thesis revolving around how the actions of these characters don't always match their ideals, and how they ultimately try to reconcile that disconnect. And with that, Peacemaker is pretty damn great and is just awesome television. It's really good. Peacemaker's positive qualities start with its story. The plot follows Peacemaker, alias Christopher Smith, who wants to eliminate crime, literally by killing criminals in brutal fashion, because that's how justice is done in America, unfortunately. Anyway, the show takes place after the events of the Suicide Squad, events that were very momentous for Peacemaker. See, Peacemaker is recovering in a hospital after his fight with Bloodsport, i.e. the Suicide Squad's main protagonist. In that film, Peacemaker had ulterior motives for his actions, mostly in how he was supposed to cover up the US government's illegal meddling in a South American country that caused many people to die and suffer, because that's how imperialism is done in America, or outside America, technically. But Peacemaker failed and is gravely injured by Bloodsport. That's why Peacemaker starts the show in a hospital bed, wondering if this means that he can go home rather than back to prison. And Peacemaker ultimately does receive an answer, but it is one with a double edge. At the behest of a contingent of government operatives, he, in exchange for his freedom, must covertly investigate and defeat an alien invasion. These aliens, dubbed the Butterflies, how menacing, are intelligent insect-like critters who invade the physical bodies of other species and control them as if they were puppets, and from there Peacemaker and the rest of the team are all that stands between the Butterflies and world domination. The story is really good, mostly because it has an overarching theme in regards to how the actions of our characters often don't match the values they espouse. Starting with the title character, Peacemaker has always believed that eliminating lawbreakers serves the greater good of establishing peace, but following the events of the Suicide Squad, our anti-hero is having an internal crisis of confidence. After all, he is haunted by the death of Flag, a character whom Peacemaker murdered in the Suicide Squad, whose dying words criticized Peacemaker's peaceful moniker as a fucking joke. And ever since then, Peacemaker has had second thoughts about his whole rationale for being a vigilante. After all, as many people in the show state, including his racist piece of shit father, who is essentially the KKK's Grand Wizard of DC supervillains, Peacemaker's methods are far from peaceful, and they often target people who do not deserve to die. Though Peacemaker's racist dad isn't complaining, seeing as Peacemaker's war on crime tends to target people of marginalized backgrounds more so than white folks, as well as people that run afoul of the US government, even if the US government's moral justifications are faulty. See Flag. And with that, Peacemaker has to figure out what it literally means to be Peacemaker. He has to figure out what he stands for, and honestly, that makes for a very compelling main character. While sure, Cena's dynamic performance makes him a goofy, likable, and sympathetic presence, albeit one who has a lot of baggage, is as vulnerable as he is dangerous, and listens to hair metal, i.e. the worst heavy metal subgenre, Peacemaker's internal conundrum really sells his character and informs the show's conflicts as he tries to save humanity from the Butterflies and as he confronts his neo-Nazi dad who was hell-bent on killing him. Indeed, what does Peacemaker stand for is a compelling question that kept me glued for the whole first season. It is a core piece of interesting character development, as well as one that doesn't have a simple, clear-cut answer, that shows how much Peacemaker changes as a character throughout the show's runtime. He has an arc, and it's really damn good. The supporting characters on Peacemaker's team all have arcs, and some even have their own crises of confidence as well. Whether we are discussing how Leota Adebayo spies on the team at the behest of her mother Amanda Waller, Harcourt's cold exterior, Vigilante's psychopathic tendencies, and desire to be Peacemaker's best friend, even though the character actually kind of irritates Peacemaker, Murn's secrets he keeps from the rest of the team, or John Economos being self-conscious over his appearance, all these characters grow from where they start at the beginning of the show. They all undergo their own personal journeys and have their own arcs as they eventually blossom and fundamentally change by the show's end, which is very satisfying from a narrative angle. After all, the act of personal change makes for some enticing cinema as we watch as all those characters overcome their own internalized obstacles, and in this regard, Peacemaker is very engaging. It has a beating heart. Of course, these characterizations are really funny as well. Seeing as these characters have more baggage than Motley Crue, the way in which these emotionally volatile characters interact with each other is hilarious. For a few examples, Peacemaker's reluctance to admit emotional vulnerability by attacking the insecurities of others makes for some witty dialogue exchanges. Vigilante's need to please Peacemaker goes to some very humorous and logical extremes. There's the way that Peacemaker mocks John's attempt at dyeing his beard, and then there's the fact that Leota Adebayo is really bad at being a covert operative, like she doesn't have that kill or be killed instinct needed for the mission. And all of these characterizations and more are placed in situations that maximize certain witty dialogue exchanges and punchlines, and as a result, Peacemaker is really damn funny throughout. The over-the-top violence really complements the comedy as well. To be blunt, there is quite a bit of gore in the show, like enough blood splatter that would make Patrick Bateman blush. But this gore has a purpose. It gives the show a certain sense of style that is often missing from most superhero movies and shows. Because to be blunt, most superhero films these days are very clean and polished and showcase inspiring heroes. But Peacemaker is different. With its litany of headshots, its cavalier attitude towards vulgar language, its incredibly flawed characters, and even its willingness to prominently portray a lesbian relationship, Peacemaker goes to places that most live-action superhero shows won't touch. Places that are normally forbidden by PG-13 ratings, government censors, and the prudish House of Mouse. And for that, Peacemaker as a show has its own distinct identity in the superhero space because it explores narrative angles and themes that most cinematic cape stories aren't allowed to. It is very unique. On one final note, I just want to point out that there is a certain irony to Peacemaker's existence as a show. As many of you know, many chuds on the internet tried to ruin James Gunn's career back in 2018. See, James Gunn was a prominent critic of then-President Donald Trump, and some far-right asshole shared some bad tweets from James Gunn's past, tweets that Gunn said that he had regretted for a long time, in order to get him fired and removed from directing Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which worked at first. He did get removed, but after a groundswelling of support, Gunn was eventually tapped by Warner Brothers to direct The Suicide Squad and eventually be the showrunner of Peacemaker. In other words, chuds tried to damage James Gunn's career beyond recognition, but instead became a nexus event that allowed Gunn to create two of the most innovative and dynamic superhero stories in recent years. After all, The Suicide Squad was really good, and Peacemaker Season 1 is awesome, and combined with the fact that Disney eventually saw the error in their ways and rehired James Gunn to direct Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the far-right's attempts to cancel James Gunn backfired in spectacular fashion, and to add insult to injury, Peacemaker was even renewed for a Season 2, meaning that the far-right's opt to sabotage Gunn's influence in nerdy spaces landed as well as a wet fart. And honestly, I kind of have to thank them for that, because truly, Peacemaker is pretty great. It has a lot of heart, a thematically cohesive message, it has interesting vulnerable characters thrown into volatile situations, and it contains a very sharp wit. It's really good, and honestly, I can't wait to see where this story goes in Season 2. Peace out. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of Peacemaker. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server and onto this credits sequence, and at least $5 a month at minimum allows you to make review requests. The link to the Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones, David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.